Okay, everybody, welcome to today's session presented by the ASTW, the Australian Society of Travel Writers, which isn't just writers. And this session today is going to be with Dan Avila, who won the Australian Photographer of the Year. I'm just going to show you quickly, for those that haven't been on our online before, how these webinars work with your control panel. So you have the cross up here that you can hide or show your control panel. You can manage your own muting. I have currently everybody unmuted at the moment except for Rachel. So Rachel, I've muted you, so just type me a little chat if you want to be unmuted. So if you're going to have outside noise or someone's going to knock at the door or whatever, please just mute yourself. You have a hand button, or you should have a hand button that you can press, and I will be the moderator for the session, so I'll be keeping an eye on that. If you press that, we will pause and I will ask Dan to take your question. You also have the chat panel here, which I'll also be moderating. So my job today is being the moderator for the session and looking after all of that side of things. So that's just a very, very quick overview. It's a very simple program and one that works really, really well. So welcome to today's session. And today's session is going to be presented by Dan Avila, and that's the handsome Dan there himself. Dan Avila is a travel writer and professional photographer with an insatiable obsession for capturing images that both evoke emotion and stir a wanderlust in the viewer. Dan is the 2016 Australian Society Travel Writer Photographer of the Year and is commissioned to produce images for books, magazines, tourism authorities across Australia and around the world. He is the ever optimist and always as enthusiastic as the day he held his first camera. Work and play remain intertwined in the pursuit of Dan's next adventure. I first met Dan actually on the phone and by Skype before we met in person, and we formed a friendship. I don't know whether that's due to our love of photography or love of adventure or what it is, but all of a sudden I realised what a passionate photographer Dan is, and he is really devoted to his art. But not only devoted to his art, he's also devoted to embracing new technology. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dan Avila. Hi Dan, and I'll let you take over.
Hi Daniel. Oh, it's wonderful. Hi Daniel, how are you? And thank you for that. And I can't see who's participating in this session, but greetings to all of you from sunny Perth. Thanks for coming along. This is obviously my first round at this, and when Daniel first mentioned this is a potential opportunity for professional development, I was only too pleased to help. And to that end, if there are any questions, obviously this is designed to be an interactive session, so if there are any questions really at all in regard to this, please just type a note, put your hand up, or do whatever you like. I was only too happy to help. So what we're going to do today is to talk through, it was going to be 3 images, but I've decided to do 4 images, and they're the images that were the awarded images that I put up for the ASTW Awards, plus one more, and I'll explain the reason for that when we get to it. So we're going to start with this first one. We're going to jump right on into this right now, and I'll explain a bit about the image and some of the decision-making processes here. I just want to explain too, the purpose of this session isn't just to talk about some shots that I took. I enjoyed taking the shots and all that sort of stuff. It's to actually look at some of the decision-making processes, the reasons why the shots were taken this way, how they were taken, because as certainly I'm seeing, and I'm assuming many of us in the society are seeing, that when we submit either a pitch or an article, it's becoming increasingly important to provide visual content with that, and that now of course is even stretching into video. So to that end, to give ourselves obviously the greatest chance of placing our articles and our work, even small changes in the way that we capture an image can make a difference. So therefore hopefully we get some value out of this. And the other thing too is I've found this, I've had a lot of mentors along the way and people that have helped me, and I'm doing a fair bit of training now in Perth and through Western Australia, so hopefully if I can help anyone, that'd be an absolute pleasure. So just jumping right in. With this particular image, this is this is an image I shot last year in Istanbul. So I'll get into a couple of the reasons and how I got to this image first, and what I do when I travel to a new location. I've never been to Istanbul before. It was all completely new. The first thing that I do, knowing when I'm either going on a famille or just a trip or anything at all, is to do a bit of research to look at what images are out there. That does a few things. It helps research the potential for certain shots. I look at the opportunities to get certain captures, and that'll indicate to me even what type of equipment might be necessary to take a shot. I look at the weather. I look at how things light at certain times of the day. I look at particular landmarks or things that really tell a story about the place that I'm going to, and do the research as much as I can before I get there. I go crazy, but do as much as I can to understand where I may get opportunities for shots that will communicate a story or communicate a feeling of actually being in that location. Now, that typically helps me about 25%. 75% is doing your own reconnaissance and traveling on the ground. So for this particular shot, I knew that obviously the Bosphorus River is extremely important. So I wanted to get a shot that certainly showed the waterfront of this particular place. That was the first thing. So do some research before going to a location, very important. Second thing, and probably the main reason I want to show this image, is that obviously we go to places, all of us, where there are wonderful landscapes. There are, and typically the first go-to thing when we want to take a picture of a wonderful landscape is let's get a really wide lens, and I don't want to over talk about jargon, by the way, and tech, but I will where necessary. A wide lens just means basically when you look through the camera, everything seems to fit in, rather than being a zoom where you're sort of zooming into a small part of a potential image. The default position for photographers when they're taking a landscape image is to use a very wide angle lens or zoom out to get everything in. And sometimes that's really great. However, when you zoom out, what you do is you separate elements in the image. You separate the foreground from the background. When you zoom in, you achieve what's known as lens compression, and you actually compress the elements together. I deliberately chose to use lens compression on this, and one way to explain that is if you look down the front right, you see the ferry there, and then it's over a kilometre back from there, probably, well, let's say 700 metres from there, is the Blue Mosque, which is the preeminent focal point in this image, which is that you can see the posts of the mosque back there. You can see the images relatively compressed together. Everything looks tight, everything looks bunched up. There's not just a wide expanse of things scattered around the image. To achieve that, you do what is not necessarily intuitive, and you use more of a zoom lens. In this particular example, I used a 70mm lens. So by doing that, I was able to actually tighten up and to fill the frame with the content that I wanted to show. And I think that's very important. You know, if the images that we're taking aren't compelling, fill the frame. And in doing so, we're able to really capture a slice of what it's like to actually be there, rather than a whole lot of superfluous things around the frame. So that's the first thing, and I think it's something that I've really been focusing on more and more. I shoot with a wide range of equipment, but these days, as much as I can, I'm using a telephoto lens to shoot landscape gear. Okay, so the next thing in terms of an image, and why I put this image up, is an image becomes naturally compelling, therefore interesting, and therefore stirring a wanderlust and making these comfortable feelings in our mind when we visually see things that have a natural, appealing composition. The composition, this is a word used all the time in photography, it just really gets down to layout. There's a few rules of composition. We can break them, But if we're going to break them, we should at least know them and break them deliberately to achieve an artistic or a creative goal. But compositionally, I'll explain why this image works from a composition point of view, and therefore why I made these decisions. Now, the first one is the much talked about rule of thirds, and that is that the major focal points, things that compositionally form this image, should fall roughly on 1/3 lines. If you just think of a screen looking like a noughts and crosses screen, things should roughly fall in that line. So if you see along the bottom of the screen, the very, very dark shadow line that sits below all the boats, that roughly sits on a 1/3 line, approximately. And if you look at the skyline, that sits along the top, that roughly sits on the 1/3 line. And then the major reason one would take an image like this is to capture the Blue Mosque, very famous, of course. You can see that also sits approximately 1/3 in from the image. So the brain feels comfortable when the eyes see something that achieves this normal composition. It's just the way that our brains work. So compositionally, this really fits within the rules. It sits on that rule of thirds, really across multiple fronts. There's a few other reasons as well why I chose to shoot in this particular way. And when we fire up the camera, and I typically on something like this, I'd use a tripod when a shot is planned. The other elements there is when we take the shot. You know, again, anybody that's read even one photography book or magazine, you hear about the golden hour and the blue hour and all these different things. You can see that this image, although it's not very stark, that there is a side light. The light's coming from the left and moving across to the right. When I did some tours and some walks of the city, I had a bit of a look at how things changed with mood as the light changed through the course of the day. You know, am I getting a more interesting shot in the morning? Am I getting a more interesting shot at night? Okay, granted, I'm probably a bit more obsessive about these things than most, and that's why when it comes to taking photos, I'll start before dawn and make sure I pick up that early light. But with this was a very comfortable after coffee shot in the later afternoon, getting that nice side light. Everything is able to be lit in that, but I'm at least getting some shapes. Typically shooting this kind of image, if you have a choice of when to shoot an image, shooting flat out in the middle of the day, it's very hard to get that same sort of compelling shot. It's a very flat light and a very harsh light. It's like taking pictures of people in a hard sunlight. You get that sort of raccoon look under the eyes. Same thing, you get a more compelling look. Some of us look gorgeous in that light, Danielle. I don't. Most people look better in a side light or this afternoon or morning light. And the same applies really in landscapes. So if we are able to, in the course of doing a trip, doing a famil, make the choice to be in these locations and angle ourselves to get there either in the early morning or late afternoon, invariably we'll get more compelling and in fact better shots. Probably just talk about briefly, just if anyone is interested, if we've got some other camera nerds out there, the settings used to achieve the shot. And again, if any questions on that, certainly fire them through. But having the chance to set this shot up, I just got into position on the bridge, found the right location, shot at 70mm, so I was using a zoom, 24 to 70mm zoom, pretty standard sort of focal length. Zoomed right in and got the composition right by just balancing it out on the tripod. I then, in terms of aperture, again, not to get too technical, but I was pretty keen to have all the elements in focus. So having all the elements in focus, it just means stopping down the aperture of the lens. I chose to stop it down to an aperture of 7.1. 7.1 to f16 would be a good choice of something like this because everything becomes in focus. In terms of shutter speed, the way I shoot these type of elements, I'm going to talk about something called dynamic range now, is I choose multiple shutter speeds. Now, my camera and many cameras give an option to do what's called bracketing, and that is to fire off an image 3, 5 or 7 images in immediate and quick succession that shoot the same image at various shutter speeds. So the ISO, or the sensitivity to light, remains the same, aperture remains the same. The only thing that varies is the shutter speed. What that does, it allows me to actually end up with the same image at different exposures, but everything else is the same. And back on the computer, I can then choose to do one of a couple of things. I can choose the image that is the most compelling. I can choose the image that is the best lit. I can choose the image that doesn't have particular elements blown out, and by blown out I mean so bright there is nothing there anymore. Or I can choose to take that pile of images and through Lightroom or Photoshop compile them into a large file and do what's called an HDR image. Again, it's something that if we're running around and taking shots, take a shot and move on, most people won't be doing. However, it is a really interesting technique to learn. I'm happy to explain that at a later time, because it provides us with an opportunity to pick up what our eye can see that our camera in one image can't. So in talking about dynamic range, because I'm going to refer to it in the other photos, I'm going to take 30 seconds to explain what I mean. Danielle, if I'm prattling on too much about that, feel free to pull me up. But I just want to draw everyone's attention to the bottom of the image where we can see under the boats, see it's very, very dark. That is the darkest point in the image. And then if we look up into the clouds, you can see it's very, very bright. There is detail in the clouds. There's no, you can still see detail. It's not blown out and detail lost, but that's very, very bright. So the range from the most darkest point image to the lightest point in the image or into the viewscape that we're looking at is the dynamic range. And our eyes are pretty amazing things. They can see within one view. We open our eyes, we look out in front of us from very dark to very light, really quite amazingly. And as fantastic as cameras are, and that we absolutely love, a camera cannot replicate the dynamic range of the human eye. It simply can't. So when we're looking at something that has very light aspects and very dark aspects, we either need to choose the bits that we really want to focus on and then set our exposure to capture that. So I could choose to make sure the sky is clear, but then the dark elements are almost black. And then, or go the other way around. I really want to pick up the detail on those boats, but the sky is completely white. It's a choice. We make those choices. And we should take control of our camera to not let a technical instrument make a creative choice for us, because we're the ones wanting to communicate the message. So the alternative to that is we take a series of images and we can make those choices back on the computer, or we can combine them to make them a single image. That's what high dynamic range is. So really in terms of that, the only thing else I want to talk about in this image is processing choices. The way that I shoot, and I'd say probably most professional photographers would shoot, is to set their cameras, the ones that can, to capture what's called RAW, which is effectively a digital negative. It's like in the old days of film, instead of being a film negative, it's a digital negative. And then instead of allowing the camera to make the creative choices, I simply make those same creative choices one by one myself in the computer to achieve the outcome. It doesn't mean I'm, making ears bigger or smaller or anything like that. It's just simply a case where I'm just making the choices on how bright the image is, understanding what the white balance is, and those different things. So we can talk about processing. Again, we can't fit everything into one presentation. But in terms of photographers wanting to get the most out of the images that they take, I would encourage photographers to shoot in RAW and to do their own post-processing. And for those thinking, yeah, that's great, you photographers, you went to uni, you did 3 years learning how to do that. I didn't. I'm an economist. I've never done any camera education at all. I did a 1-day or a half-day course. Everything else I'm self-taught. It all can be done. It's all the information's out there. Ask people like me. So really that's that one there, and it's really about making the choice, picking the location, choosing the right time of day, and understanding that getting a compelling image sometimes means zooming in, not zooming out. So on that note, Danielle, unless there's any further questions, we're happy to push on to the next slide.
Thank you, Dan. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. One of the and if anybody would like to ask a question after I raise this one with Dan, we will give you a couple of moments after Dan answers this first question. Dan, what do you find useful when you are researching a location? So I guess the person's asking, what are some of the most useful things that you look at before you go to a new location?
Great stuff. So first thing I do is I look at things like Flickr, I look at Instagram, I look at and I look at Google Images. I look at other images that other photographers or even artists have shot in a particular location to get a sense of the people that have gone before me. I mean, look, most of the time people in the society go to location. We're not going for 6 months. We're going for 3 days or 10 days. So we've got to be really judicious with our time. And in many cases, we're moving, right? So we're touring or we're visiting a series of locations. So we often don't get to go back. So what I really try to do, I'm always anxious about it when I first go. I wouldn't say I'm panicked, but I'm anxious to make sure that when I'm visiting, I get to at least get to the spots that will get the result and try to get to them in the right time of day. So the things that I do is I look online. My first spot, I just jump on, I Google the location, I search images only, and then I flick through the images to look at what other people have done on the basis of their research before me, to look at times of day. First thing, look at what time of day are people shooting. Some of it just depends on the angles of all the buildings, all the locations. Is it best to shoot in the morning or the evening? It doesn't mean I'm not shooting in the middle of the day, and there's certain things that look fantastic in the middle of the day, beautiful blue oceans and things like that. But I do the research first by looking at other images, other locations. I plan on a map, and then I look at where I would like to be at various points in the day, and no matter what I'm doing, if I'm visiting, reading or whatever, within a particular familiar trip, I absolutely plan to be on certain locations for no other reason than to take images. When I was actually doing this shot here, I actually, not to get too graphic, I had a lung infection. I just come off skiing in pretty cold weather. I got a bit crook. I was really, really ill. It was -2 degrees in Istanbul. It was snowing. It would have been quite convenient to just sort of park up in the hammam and have a quiet drink. But I was really focused on being on this particular bridge at this particular time of day. Now, I don't remember how crook I felt necessarily, but I'm really happy that I captured the image. And it's about doing the research first and working out where you're going to be. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Dan. Does that answer the question for you, Lynn?
Yes, thanks, Danielle.
Thank you. Does anybody else have another question for Dan over this image before we move on? Okay, so we're going to move on.
Yeah, certainly we'll move on there. But just probably on this one alone, I know we often see, when we see these gorgeous shots that involve water, one of the things that we see often is this really sort of silky, surreal, amazingly calm waters that are achieved through having a long shutter speed. Just on that, you'll notice that the water looks very much like you would expect the water to see. And having a long shutter speed would have messed up one thing in the image really quite dramatically, which we all can probably guess. And you see the wheeling gulls flying over the city. There's only one way to capture those, and that's with the fast shutter speed. So often we see these sort of surreal, silky images. When you've got animals moving, you've got to speed that shutter speed up, otherwise it's just a horrible blur. Anyway, that's that for that image.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'd also just, while we're clicking on to the next image, I'm just going to explain a little bit with the Australian Photographer of the Year Awards. So we're going to see Dan's 3 winning images. They submit 3 images that go to a panel of judges. None of our judges are members at all, so we have judges from right across the world judging now. Last year was the first year that we've done that. This year, I can say it's this year now, For members, we're very excited because we're actually bringing in a new photography award. So there will be 2 photography awards this year. One will be a folio of images and one will be one image that can come from that folio. And fingers crossed, we are also introducing a video award. So that's something to look forward to. We've got a few new awards that are coming on board this year for our awards evening. So I'll hand back over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Danielle. I think it's great. Obviously, the Australian Society of Travel Writers, there are other travel media in that, and it's as we're seeing, it's becoming really, really important to capture images, even for. I mean, I'm starting to make video, and I'm by no means a professional videographer, so I think we all have to be multi-skilled, multi-talented, and do multiple things on a trip to win the work. So I think it's great those awards are there. Look, in terms of this image was very different. I'll explain firstly where this is. So this is lifting off over Queenstown in New Zealand by helicopter. Head off to shoot some various locations over Milford Sound and glaciers and the like. On the last image, we talked about sort of planning and doing the research and having a look and being ready to be at a spot. At the same time, I'm sure we're all the same way when we're visiting a location, where we're seeing something for the first time. There are so many things that happen in a blink of an eye that represent a feeling or emotion or an event that you couldn't plan. It just happens, and that's the joy of travel. It's one of the reasons we all do it. It's not staged, it's not planned. So to that end, we kind of have a responsibility when we go somewhere to capture those things. That's why we're there. We're either capturing them in words, or hopefully we're also capturing them in an image as well. And it doesn't matter if you're using our iPhone or a DSLR, same thing applies. So when I'm traveling in somewhere like this, or in fact traveling anywhere, the first thing, I don't have my camera off, my camera's on. I don't just leave it neutral. I actually preset the camera to broadly fit the conditions that I'm in. And by doing it, I'm able to, in the event that something amazing, in my opinion, happens, or some vista pops up, I can take that image with relatively no changes in settings, because things happen for a blink of an eye. That's what happened here. So this is an image. I was sitting in the back seat of a helicopter before people rotated. This image happened over my far right shoulder. I sort of spun around. It was quite a cool day, and then in one moment, this sort of glorious sunburst moment happened. Could almost hear the music as the hand of God just reached down and touched the landscape. I thought, fantastic. I'm crammed in. I stuck the camera underneath my armpit and had a bit of a side view through the viewfinder, peeled off the shot, and then looked at the image on the back of the screen and thought, you beauty, I got it. And it was just really there for a couple of seconds. So to me, that reinforced to myself, be ready. Have your camera ready. If you have a camera, have it ready, and otherwise you miss opportunities like that. And the shot's got a lot of traction. I'm really happy with it. I'm really glad I took it. So to that end, how to be ready. It's great. Yeah, be ready. Well, what do you do? All right. So this is about 7 o'clock in the morning. You can see on that image up the top, most of it was cloudy, except for when the sunburst came through. So knowing that it's relatively dark, and knowing that I'm going to be moving, I'm in a helicopter, what I knew I needed to do is to have my camera set so my shutter speed is relatively quick. Sorry, can everyone else hear that in the background? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, all good. No problem, sorry guys. So really, on this particular image, when I'm moving and it's dark, I'm going to have a fast shutter speed, but with a fast shutter speed, it's pretty dark because the shutter's only open for a short period of time, so I just boosted the sensitivity of the camera. So here I've set my ISO on 400. Again, most of our cameras, you can choose these things, so set the ISO on 400, and I set the shutter speed. Every time on a helicopter, my standard shutter speed is 1/800th of a second. From there, I can then make choices on the aperture, and I just chose to have a sort of mid-range aperture of circa 5.6. So here, by doing so, and shooting in RAW, I can deal with colours later on. It meant that I could basically peel off shots, have a bit of a look at the back of the screen, make a small change, and I'm going to be able to capture those images. Why this shot works, in my opinion, is for a couple of reasons. The first one, again, is composition. The composition of this image, again, same rules as the last shot. Effectively, things are divided up. The important visual cues and visual aspects within this image are aligned in the rule of thirds. The first thing is, where is our eye drawn on an image? If you look at an image, if everything is roughly the same amount of light or dark as an image, if there's no visual cues for our eyes to draw to, our eyes don't know where to go to, and therefore are uncomfortable when we look at the image. Our eyes are drawn typically to the lighter part of the image or areas of high contrast. So in this, the first thing our eye is drawn to is the light of the sky, and shortly after that, where the sun is just washing warm light over a misty landscape. And that roughly sits in around the 1/3 lines of the image, so therefore compositionally it's pleasing. It has a combination of dark sections and light sections, so there's good contrast, and our eye can move from one section to another, and therefore the image therefore tells a story because our eye gets drawn around by the composition. As Danielle points out, one of the things I like about Danielle's imagery particularly as a trained photographer is that Danielle always shoots with good foreground content. There's something in the image in the foreground that anchors the image, and it's an important part of when we shoot. Not just a broad vista if we can avoid it, something that gives a foreground focal point. In this, the best that I could do is to use this icy river to show some sort of foreground anchoring, and I was lucky enough that it formed this really nice S-bend through that image, which to the human eye is typically very pleasing. And then of course it's mirrored by the S-bends that are around the mountain as well. So that's really that about that particular image. We talked in the last one about dynamic range, and again, pressure, all that is the light to dark elements in an image. And you can see if you look at the clouds, look at the sky up there and the brightest section of the sky. We talked about being blown out. That is in fact blown out. And even in post-production, I was okay with that area of the sky being blown out. I think to me, artistically, although technically it means that the image is less than perfect because I have a blown out section. There's actually that particular part of the sky, but artistically it worked. So I allowed myself to make that choice to get a better artistic result. I'm not interested in perfect technical results. The artistic side and the visual side must come first. So that's really it about that image in terms of settings, how I set. And look, a lot of people get up in the sky, they're in a small plane, they're in a helicopter. Again, how should we set our cameras for something like that? Shoot fast. 1/800th, aperture fairly low, in this circumstance aperture of about f4, and then I shot fairly wide on this, around about 24 millimeters. So, and in terms of post-production, final element on that, the first thing you sort of see with post-production is, and in fact most times we take an image, things look a little bit blue, they look a little bit orange, that's our white balance. Here I elected to allow the camera, through using a cloudy setting to start with and then also modifying in post-production, to let the oranges of the light that I saw with my eye carry through into that image. So that's really that. Is there any questions on this?
Any questions on that image, everyone? No, it doesn't look like. Dan, do you mind if I just point something out here to everybody just really quickly? And
Please.
When we were looking at these images, for those of you that are into your photography, and composition is, I like to say, it's a tool. It's in our belt. You know, we're carpenters and we have all these different tools. And Dan explained before about the rule of thirds. If you notice on this image, the S of the river and the S line of all the different lines that we can use is the one that really invigorates the human brain the most. So the human brain loves the S line best, which Dan's got, you know, these two beautiful S lines here. But this bend of the river is right on where two of those compositional third lines meet, and that is what we call the sweet spot. And so that really helps this image even so much more, is that is right on what we call the sweet spot, as is what is happening over there. So really great compositional image, this one, for those of you that are looking to learn about compositional tools that you can use in your image making. If we're happy, I'll go on to the next slide if there's no more other questions.
Yeah, Daniel, can you hear me?
Yes, John, hello.
Yeah, good. I'm sorry, I won't interrupt you guys because this is fascinating. I'm sorry I couldn't get onto you because my microphone was just not working, which is fairly bad news for a radio man. But anyway, I've switched into you all now via the telephone, so I'm hearing everything and seeing everything. So sorry to interrupt and sorry to be late, but I haven't missed a thing. You've just missed me, and that's no big deal.
That's lovely.
Hi, John.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, thanks, John. All right, we'll go on to our next image. So this is the third image from Dan's winning folio. And over to you, Dan.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Probably the first thing to talk about this image is actually placed on a slide, and the slide has a black background. So the image was shot portrait, not landscape, so obviously straight up and down. So the sides of this image being all black, although it kind of looks like that's what the photo was, that's not what the photo is. So I don't know if I've explained that very well, but it just means that I was talking before about filling the frame, and now it looks like I haven't filled the frame. No, I did. So just kind of in your mind's eye, just picture it being a lot more sort of zoomed in, if you like. So here, again, it's when we take a picture, I think it's important that our goals are to tell a story. We're taking a picture to either for its own purposes because we want to, or we're taking a picture because we want it to support a story that we are going to tell in words, or we're simply trying to completely tell a story in a single image. And sometimes you've got to be a little bit bossy. Okay, it's one of those things, you've got to push people around a little bit, ask them to do certain things, use your people skills. And in this event, this shot was taken off the Western Australian Kimberley coast. It was on a shoot on a boat called the Great Escape. This little island, what we're on here, only exists in low tide. It appears for about 3 hours, and then it is swallowed up by the ocean and crocodiles and sharks and all that sort of stuff. It's a very sort of primal location. What I wanted to show here is that kind of primal feel about being sort of alone in the universe, because aside from this small group of people, there was no one around for literally many hundreds of kilometres. So to take this shot, and everybody's standing around and enjoying a drink or 3 or 5, I simply asked this group to come nice and tight to the fire. I wanted that glow of the fire being on the faces of these people. There's no artificial light used in this image at all. Obviously, to get this image with a little amount of light, I had to make certain choices in the camera. So the choices are shoot with a higher ISO. In other words, make the camera more sensitive to light. I shot as slow as I dared shoot, asking people to stand still when all they wanted to do was have a laugh, look at the fire and have a few more drinks. So I got them to come in nice and tight. I shot at about 1/4 of a second. I captured that image with the camera on a tripod, with the camera extremely still, and capture these people at the bottom part of the frame. Then I let everybody go do their thing. It's a single image I took. This sort of smudge that you see above the image is not in fact a smudge. That is in fact the Milky Way, and that is all the sort of stardusts and all the various little astrological compositions that are in the Milky Way that, if we know how to shoot it, all our cameras can pick up. So what I did here is to say, okay, I want to capture the Milky Way, which is, by comparison, extremely dull in terms of light, not very bright, and then at the same time I've got a bonfire raging away here that's very bright. no way can that be captured in a single image. So what I did is I took 2 images, let everybody go do their thing, and then cranked up ISO to 6400, so made the camera very, very sensitive to light. I shot at 17 millimeters, so very, very wide. Don't have to, but I chose to. And then the standard setting for astral photography, you want to take pictures of the stars, your starting position is 30-second exposure. Now, unless you're completely magic, your heart doesn't beat, and you don't breathe, and you don't blink, you're going to have to put your camera on a tripod, or on the ground, or on a bag, or on a bean bag, or something like that. But by doing so, we're able to capture the light of the Milky Way. Our shutter stays open, all the light of the stars continually getting sucked in and delivered onto the sensor that is our camera, and long enough to capture the light of all the stars and the light of distant stars that we in fact can't see with our eyes, but not so long that the Earth moves and causes the stars to blur. So, rule of thumb, as bright as you can set your settings in your camera, the aperture as open as you can set your lens to be, 6400 ISO, 30-second exposure, you're all going to capture stars, and it's going to look fantastic. So then, all I did is in Photoshop, I then connected those 2 images together as I saw them as one image, and compositionally just stitched them. How to do that? Subject of another chat, but it's not that hard. Okay, anyone wants to know, send me a message later, I'll show you how to do it. But that's really what I wanted to achieve. Why the image worked, I think because for a number of reasons it tells a story of being alone in the universe. How do you do that? You've got to capture the universe, right? So that's all that I was capturing. The background is fortunately there's no moon, because the moon unfortunately provides light pollution, and all that does, the moon overwhelms the stars. So there was no moon, there's no clouds. Obviously that worked. You're going to shoot clouds, all you're going to see is clouds, you're going to see mush. There was not even much wind stirring up dust and salt into the atmosphere. All those things cloud up the image. So yes, it was lucky that these things came together. When they did come together, though, I was able to plan that image. I made the choice to go right back and to not sort of zoom in and get the people close, because I wanted to show them as being part of a very, very large scene, being the universe. It's very, very large. Now, it's, again, I was kind of asking you now to imagine the composition, but if you imagine the frame is just trimmed on one side on the left, pretty close to the fire, and on the right, so it just captures the Milky Way, that's what that image looks like. So this is, in fact, where we make a creative choice in the field. We plan, and then we composite images to create something that our cameras cannot do in a single image. Any questions on that one?
Are there any questions for Dan? Dan, I've got a quick question while people are thinking. When you shot the Milky Way image, were you on the other side of the fire?
That's a very good question. Actually, yes, I was. So I set up the camera to be in the same angle. I set up the camera, all the settings were the same. It's a fixed lens, it's 17 millimeters. What I needed to do is to remove any chance of light pollution. So I actually had a little torch to see what I was doing. One of the other things I was doing as well was just watching out for crocodiles, because unlike sharks, those buggers come on the land. So, you know, have a bit of a torch, be aware of the situation. Yes, it's a bit of a pain because you're in pretty much complete darkness. Keep very still, lock up the mirror, use timer sensor, do everything you can do to not disturb the camera. Again, that's probably a whole other talk. But I got out of the way of the light, absolutely.
Great. And for those of you that are using a DSLR, when you go into a tripod, if you've got an image stabilized or vibration reduction on your lens, you must turn that off. Are there any other questions for Dan on this image? Okay, so we'll move on, Dan. Dan, I've actually just put down that we'll have a chat afterwards about doing one on how to stitch images together. It'll be nice and short, and I think that would be a great one for us to do for everybody. So that's Dan's 3 wing images. What we're going to do now is Dan has got one other image that he would like to show us and talk to us through, which I think is absolutely a beautiful image. So Dan, over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. There's a reason I wanted to put this image up, and I think again, when we take shots, if we apply the rules, things come together, and we end up with a shot that's really valuable to us. We end up with something in our arsenal that allows us to write certain things or to be placed in certain situations. And there's a few things about this particular image that tick all of the classical boxes that really work. So this image I shot at Orchestra a couple of months ago. I'm on assignment for a book. It's called Australia in Style, put out by Aaron Williams every 4 years, and so I'm shooting. This is one of the 6 shoots I've done for them all around Australia. Orchestra, for those who don't know, is an enormous station in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and it's famous for its wild, big landscapes and its harsh rocks, and it's interesting, gorgeous. One of the things that, as a landscape photographer, I'm really trying to do a lot more of, and procure a lot of work doing this now, is to make sure, if we can, to humanize an image. Now, I have the same image effectively taken without a person in the shot, but by putting a person in the shot, we allow whoever is looking at the shot to visualize actually being there. And if someone can visualize themselves being there, they actually want to be there, and we're achieving our goal. We're stirring a wanderlust in our audience. So I think it's important to remember why we're taking the images, because eventually someone theoretically and hopefully is going to use them to draw people to go to that location. Putting a person in the image is not always possible, but when we can do it and we can get the context right, it really resonates in an image. If we look at the requirements now of the tourism authorities of Tourism Western Australia, Queensland and the like, they'll actually set out, they want people in the images almost all of the time because it has an effect. So with this particular image, why this works and the technical reasons why it's set up this way is, firstly, the obvious thing we just talked about is the person in the image. This is Sarah, she was my guide. She's an absolutely brilliant photographer herself, and I just asked her nicely if she'd be prepared to sit in the image, and she was happy with that. So I precariously stuck her on the edge of a cliff. Don't worry, there's a little bit of a ledge under there before it drops away about 100 odd metres. So yes, please be aware of safety. I have to keep reminding myself, as my wife does, every time there's a shoot, don't take any risks, because we get a bit caught up in the image. But she was happy to be in the image, and so what I did here is to get her to close her eyes so she can go blind looking into the sun, which is at about 4:45 in the morning, to sit extremely still. And I took 7 images at the same location in quick succession at different exposure levels. And the reason I did this is, if this image was taken as a single shot, the sun would be lit like that, but everything else in the image would effectively be black. If I made it so you could see the back, if you look at Sarah's shirt, she's a ranger, the ranger's shirt, you can see the back of her shirt, which is away from the sun. It's not black, it's not a total shadow, we can see it. So by shooting an image that's also too bright for the sun, I'm able to collect the information that's in the shadow area. There's no way any camera can do that in a single shot. So I have to take multiple shots. How do you do it? Not a problem. Take the time. Go. Sorry, is there a question? No, sorry, I heard something in the background. If there's a question, just please interrupt me. But essentially, having the camera on a tripod, having my subject sit very, very still, having the same focal point, everything set on manual, and firing off at a fast shutter speed to capture the bright, bright sun in a way that we can actually see it, right through to a slow shutter speed where I capture all the shadows of the foreground and the shadow behind the subject's shirt. So that's how I captured the exposures. again, the reason why the image is relatively compelling is that effectively this is the rule of thirds personified. The horizon line, the most obvious, the first thing our eyes drawn to is the brightest part of the image, is basically, roughly, on the 1/3 line across the top. The position of the sun is not in the center, albeit if I did the shot again, I'd probably push the sun over to the right a little bit more compositionally, but it's not in the center, it's pushing towards the 3rd line. As a counterbalance to that, if you look where Sarah's sitting, she's also on the 3rd line. And then we've got some foreground weight down the bottom to offset the foreground light off the top. And then the final aspect of composition, you can see that big, long, diagonal cliff line, that's just drawing a reverse Z. If you can see the reverse Z being drawn from the line across the top, the composition right down through the diagonal, and then the bottom, the reverse Z, again, a little bit like the S line, is a good compositional link. So the reason I wanted to put this up, probably because the image before that's a bit hard to see, but also just to reinforce it as people shooting wonderful landscapes, if we can just wrangle someone in, sweet talk, bat your eyelids, do whatever you need to do, get someone in the image that's prepared to be in the shot. You don't need to get them sitting there smiling at you looking cheesy, but in the shot, in a reflective position, where they're participating in the shot, we end up with a more compelling image. And as a result, this image is being used by Tourism Northwest for their annual Kimberley Planner. So that's why I thought it was worthwhile showing that. Again, dynamic range, we're able to get all the shadows and the detail in those rocks right the way through to the sun. Aside from that, happy to answer any questions.
Right. The other thing that I really like in this image, Dan, and I have unmuted myself, haven't I? Yes. Is for those of you with your composition, is the beautiful framing that Dan's used with the grass. And what that does is it forms that border and brings our eye into the subject and into the landscape. And as Dan was saying, this is something that, you know, people will use your images more if they're not what we call a ghost image, which is just, you know, nothing in there. And especially in the travel media, this is the sort of stuff that we're getting asked more and more and more to do. So it's where people like Dan and I and the other photographers on board here, we love it when people come along with us because we'll stick them in our shots. I'll open it up for questions. Are there any questions?
No questions, but I just like to say that photograph has such a subtle glossiness to it. It almost looks like a painting.
Yeah, thank you. And again, to achieve that sort of that subtle look, there's a couple of things that we can do. If anyone listening here uses Lightroom or Photoshop or things like that, the first thing there is normally our cameras want to give us a punchy, contrasty image. The reason is we look at the back of the screen and we pull it up and we think, wonderful, it's a nice, you know, the image is banging, it's got some punch. However, in this circumstance, what I did is actually reverse that out. You can see there's not much contrast in the image in a way that you would normally think, because again, if you look at the back of the subject's shirt, it's really quite bright. So eliminating a lot of that contrast, which is automatically going to be there when you're shooting directly into the sun, is what's achieved to give that sort of airy feel. If the sky, for example, is not blown out, you can actually see the dust. There's actually a bushfire going on at this time, so it was a little bit hairy up there. But looking through that haze and that dust, you know, sometimes we just use these things to our advantage. Is that way. So I think everyone can do it. There's nothing in this that you need some special special enzymes or some special skill set or some secret. It's absolutely doable. With even more moderate and basic cameras to achieve that look. But again, it has to be deliberate.
Dan, there's a couple of questions that are coming in through the chat panel. One is, hi Dan, how do you manage to get the foreground and background relatively sharp?
It's an excellent question. When we're taking a picture of a person, often we're trying to do the opposite of that. Focus on something, let everything else blur. What we're referring to with sharpness across the range of the photo is achieving a very large, it's called a depth of field. And a depth of field, basically, if you look at the grass down the bottom left side, that's pretty close to me. And then looking at the mountainscape a ways away, that's obviously probably 30, 40, 50 kilometres away. Achieving sharpness across all of that distance from the focal plane is achieving a large depth of field. There's a few things that influence that. The first thing is which most people don't know actually, is the wider angle the lens is. The wider the lens, the larger the depth of field is on the image. If you're using a telephoto, for some people using a 70 to 200 millimeter and they're zooming into 200, you have a very, very narrow depth of field. It's just a phenomenon with using a lens. So it helped me here that I was using a wide angle lens. This was shot at 24 millimeters, which is a wide lens. So the default position of that lens, it's a fairly wide depth of field. Because I'm shooting on a tripod, I don't have to worry about being so quick on the shutter speed to capture a sharp image because I'm stabilized. The subject is in a stable position. She's well anchored. She's sitting, she's got her hands placed, she can be very, very still. So I can afford to do what's called stopping the lens down to shoot at 7.1 or even at a smaller aperture than that allows everything to be sharp. So that's the second thing. First one, shoot wide. Second one, stop down your aperture. And the third one is, where the hell do you focus? What's the focus point that gets everything sharp? When we focus in a landscape or in a viewscape, if we pick a point to tell the camera or to manually focus on, focus isn't on that one point. It's on a spread of distance that is effectively 1/3 in front of that and 2/3 behind it, rule of thumb. So I knew if I stood back a little bit and focused just between that lump of grass and where Sarah's sitting, I knew that I would get a very wide, everything will be sharp really across the foreground, and because of those other reasons I just said, it would be sharp enough across the background. So understand those couple of things. Where to focus is really, really important. If in doubt, my default position is I focus 1/3 into the overall depth of the image that I'm shooting. If that makes sense. 1/3 in is going to give me I don't worry about working my some sort of mystical calculation using some mathematical formula, which you can do to get the best focal point, my hyperfocal distances. I don't worry about any of that. If I need to make a choice, I want everything sharp, I shoot 1/3 into the image, and then I use those other elements that I talked about, shoot wide and stop the aperture down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dan. The next question that we've got coming, Dan, is did you manipulate the image in Photoshop to mix the different shutter speed shots, or did the camera put them together into a composite?
Excellent question. The 5D Mark III Canon will actually composite all the images together to produce a single file, and then it will output them after processing. Having said that, I haven't used that feature once. I reckon it's crap. It looks horrible. Why? Because I'm asking this machine to make decisions about the shots that I've taken that it can't possibly know. It doesn't know my priorities. It doesn't know what I want to achieve. So although I was really happy when this new camera had this facility, after taking the first one, I was so disappointed with it. I've never used it again. Now, probably I just gave up on it too quickly. Maybe it would work in other situations, but the way that I take the shots, because I shoot raw. If you have a camera that shoots raw, you're going to go to this location, you're either being paid or you're paying to go to this location, take the extra 10 minutes to process an image that's going to be a keeper for life and shoot raw. I really encourage everybody, and if you don't know how to do it, there's people around that can help you do it. I'm one of them. So, and Danielle is as well. So shoot raw, compile the images, bring them into Lightroom. Most people use Lightroom or Photoshop. It's really the same thing when you shoot RAW. Open the images, select them, blend to HDR, and then you get all that information in one file. And then you just start at the top and go down the bottom and process the image that way. Again, it's not enough time to go through image processing. To me, it's 50% of taking the image. One is shooting it, the other one's processing it.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Dan. We're getting a lot of comments through that people would love to have some post-processing workshops like this, Dan, which we can quite easily do. So Dan and I will look at that. What I'd like to do now, our time is almost up. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. This is a new initiative with the Australian Society of Travel Writers and Media. Karen, do you like that? How we're starting to use that word? We are hoping that you enjoy these sessions. This is something very new, so we would love your feedback, either on the closed group would be great for you to let us know. We have got more planned and some fabulous ones planned. We've looked at trying to run these at lunches and at different sessions. I know they're flying me to Melbourne, but everybody is just so busy and they're travelling. We have online today, Dan. So Dan is actually sitting in Perth at the moment and he's delivering from Perth. I'm up on the beautiful Tamborine Mountain. John Kerr's just down below me. We've got people from Wellington, Tasmania online, regional Queensland. These are all being recorded and they will be placed on our members section of our website for people to go in at any time and review these and have a look. So we would love your feedback, members, whether this is something that is worthwhile for us to continue. At the moment, I'm donating my program while we just see whether it is something that members would like. We would like to take this to another level eventually, is that our presenters at some stage will be paid presenters and people and the ASTW will be able to afford their own program. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'll just do a quick last check of questions. Everybody's coming in, Dan, saying it's wonderful. Thank you very much. Fabulous. Glad you've all enjoyed it. Once the session is stopped recording, I will then render it and the link will be placed up on Facebook this afternoon for you, and that will also all go out into our newsletters. Dan, Avila, thank you so much for your time. You've just been fantastic. And would you like to say anything before we finish the session?
Oh, just obviously I hope people got something out of it. It's an absolute pleasure to help anybody that wants help. I've really benefited a lot in my career with a few people that have just been generous enough to not withhold any secrets or, you know, the special sauce. I've just made it a point that if anyone has any questions at any time, I don't care if they're talking about thinking about buying a camera or how to shoot or what to do, yeah, feel free to contact me at any time. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure to do this, and hopefully people got something out of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you all online shortly. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Daniel.